In 1930, 60 cents of every single dollar spent in a Canadian department store went to one company. Not Hudson's Bay, not Simpson's, Eaton's. For 130 years, the T. Eaton Company was not just a place to shop. It was where Canadian families waited for the mail-order catalog to arrive every autumn like a second Christmas. It was the parade that stopped a nation's children on Toronto's streets every December, broadcast coast to coast on radio and then on television. It was the store where a family paid 50 cents a week on layaway just to put a coat under the tree. Millions of Canadians built their childhoods around this name. Then on October 17, 1909, every remaining door closed, permanently, in a single day. How does a company that shaped the way an entire country shopped for 13 decades disappear almost overnight? The answer involves two generations of a single family, a catalog that once defined hope for working people, and a mistake so large it took down an empire that seemed too big to fail. Timothy Eaton was not born to build an empire. He was born to fail at smaller things first. He came into the world in County Antrim, in what is now Northern Ireland, one of the youngest of 9 children in a farming family. By the time he was 20, he had already spent years apprenticed to a shopkeeper in the village of Portglenone, rising before dawn to unlock the doors and not closing them again until nearly midnight. He slept on a small pallet tucked beneath one of the store counters. It was not a childhood, it was training. In 1857, Timothy left Ireland behind and sailed for Upper Canada, following 2 of his brothers who had already made the crossing. He landed in a small village called Glen Williams in Halton County and went back to what he knew, working a counter in someone else's store. But Timothy wanted something of his own. With his brothers Robert and James, he tried his hand at a bakery in the tiny community of Kirkton, Ontario. It failed within months. Bread was not going to be his path forward. What Timothy carried out of those failures was not despair. It was a very specific irritation. He hated haggling. He hated watching a customer and a shopkeeper circle each other over price like two people who didn't trust one another, because in most cases they didn't. He hated the credit system even more. The slow bleed of debt that kept working families tied to merchants who controlled what they could buy and when. He had watched it wear people down for years, and he had decided there was a better way to run a store, even if no one else in Canada was running one that way yet. In 1869, with his wife Margaret and their 3 young children, Timothy moved to Toronto. He found a small space at the corner of Yonge and Queen Streets, 24 feet wide, 60 feet deep, tucked south of the city's fashionable shopping district on King Street. Nobody knew his name. There was no reputation to draw customers through the door. On Wednesday, December 8, 1869, on a cold, dry winter morning, Timothy Eaton unlocked that door for the first time. Inside, he did something almost nobody else in the country was doing. Every item had one price, marked plainly, and that price did not move depending on who was asking or how well they could argue. Customers paid cash. No credit books, no running tabs that could ruin a family slowly, one missed payment at a time. Eaton's own words, printed for anyone who walked past his windows, said it plainly. Goods sold for cash only, one price to everyone. He backed it with another promise that would define the company for generations. Goods satisfactory or money refunded. To a city full of people accustomed to bargaining and being bargained down, this was strange. It was also, to the working families of Toronto, an enormous relief. They knew exactly what they would pay before they ever spoke to a clerk. They knew that if something was wrong with what they bought, they were not stuck with it. The store grew. Word moved through Toronto's working-class neighborhoods the way word always does, one satisfied customer telling another. Within little more than a decade, that first cramped space at Yonge and Queen could no longer hold what Timothy Eaton had built. He would need something far larger, but the idea that made it all possible had already taken root on that cold December morning. A Canadian department store that treated every customer, rich or poor, exactly the same. By the 1920s, Eaton's was no longer simply a store. It was a season, a ritual, a shared memory that generations of Canadian families lived inside without ever quite naming it that way. Nowhere was that clearer than in Winnipeg. When the Eaton store opened there in 1905, 25,000 people walked through its doors, 1 out of every 5 residents of the entire city. Three cheers rose up from the crowd that day as Timothy Eaton himself toured the new building, later admitting he had gone over it looking for something to criticize and could not find a single fault. Winnipeggers gave the store its own nickname almost immediately, the Big Store. Within weeks, its staff of 750 had grown to 1,200. By 1919, it employed 8,000 people across 21 acres of retail space. On an ordinary busy day, 1 out of every 10 people in Winnipeg walked through those doors, and 50 cents of every shopping dollar spent in the city landed in Eaton's registers. This was the pattern the company repeated, city after city for half a century, and by 1930 it had become something close to a national institution. 60 cents of every dollar Canadians spent in a department store went to Eaton's alone. But the number that mattered most to ordinary families was not a statistic. It was a booklet that arrived in the mailbox every fall. The first Eaton's catalog had gone out in 1884, 32 pages advertising goods to visitors at the Toronto Industrial Exhibition. By the 20th century, it had grown into something else entirely, a lifeline for families who lived hundreds of miles from the nearest city, and a promise for families who lived right next door to a store, but still could not always walk in and pay outright. As the railway network expanded, Eaton's began offering lower freight rates and eventually free shipping on any order over $25. In 1903, the company built an entire mail-order building in Toronto just to keep up with demand. For homesteading families on the prairies, farmers hundreds of kilometers from a city street, and working parents in small towns across the country, that catalog was often the only department store they would ever set foot in, and it arrived at their kitchen table every single autumn like clockwork. What did it feel like for a child to hold that catalog? Pages of winter coats, ice skates, dolls, and tools, each one a small possibility waiting to be circled in pencil. For families with very little money, the Christmas edition of the Eaton's catalog was not just a shopping tool. It was proof that abundance existed somewhere, even if it had to be saved for. And saving was exactly how many families managed it. Eaton's layaway system let working-class households set aside a coat, a bicycle, or a Christmas gift months in advance, paying it off in small weekly amounts until it was finally theirs to bring home. For a single mother working a factory floor, or a father between jobs, that 50-cent a week payment was not an inconvenience. It was dignity, a way to give a child a real gift under the tree without ever touching a moneylender or a pawnbroker. Then every December, that dignity became a public celebration. In 1905, Eaton's launched the Santa Claus Parade in Toronto, and within a generation, it had become the largest parade in North America. Families lined the route 1.5 miles long, children perched on their father's shoulders, waiting for the moment Santa's sleigh finally rounded the corner. The parade was broadcast live on radio and later on television, carrying that single afternoon in downtown Toronto into living rooms across the entire country. Alongside Santa rode a small, sad-eyed stuffed bear named Pumpkinhead, an advertising creation who became, almost by accident, one of the most beloved characters in Canadian retail history. Children who grew up watching that parade would one day bring their own children to stand on the same curb. The flagship stores themselves became something closer to civic landmarks than places of commerce. In winter, Eaton's and its great rival, Simpson's, standing almost directly across the street from one another in Toronto, competed to outdo each other with animated Christmas window displays, mechanical figures built using surplus motors, and the craftsmanship of aircraft technicians returning from the Second World War. Crowds gathered on the sidewalk just to watch toy soldiers march and reindeer nod their heads behind glass. That stretch of Yonge Street became, for a few weeks each year, the busiest pedestrian crossing in the entire country. Inside Winnipeg's big store and Toronto's flagship alike, the buildings held far more than merchandise. There was a lunch counter that fed office workers and shoppers who had walked for hours. There was a social club, the Eaton Social and Athletic Club, that organized dances, card nights, and curling leagues for the very staff who spent their days behind the counters. For thousands of employees, Eaton's was not simply a paycheck. It was a community that existed inside the walls of the store itself, generation after generation, parents training their own children into the same aisles they had worked for decades. What made all of this so powerful was not any single department or any single sale. It was the way the entire experience repeated itself, family after family, decade after decade. Grandparents who had once circled toys in the catalog, as children now watching their grandchildren do exactly the same thing, standing on the same parade route, saving for the same layaway coat. For most of the 20th century, it seemed as though Eaton's would simply always be there, as permanent a fixture of Canadian life as winter itself. But permanence is a feeling, not a fact. And even as the parades marched on and the catalogs kept arriving, the first quiet decisions were already being made in offices far from the shop floor. Decisions that would, decades later, prove that nothing, no matter how deeply loved, is guaranteed to last forever. Every empire has a moment when growth stops being a choice and starts being an addiction. For Eaton's, that moment arrived early, and it arrived through family ambition rather than boardroom strategy. By the early 1900s, Timothy Eaton's son, John Craig Eaton, was pushing his father toward the west. The original plan was modest: a building in Winnipeg to serve the mail-order business already reaching prairie farmers by rail. But John Craig wanted more than a warehouse. He wanted a second flagship. His father agreed, and in 1905, a 5-story Eaton store opened on Portage Avenue, transforming what was meant to be a distribution point into the second great pillar of the company. The success in Winnipeg proved something important. Eaton's did not need to stay a Toronto phenomenon. It could become a national one. From there, the company expanded methodically, rather than recklessly, city by city, always anchored by two things that had built the brand in the first place: the mail-order catalog reaching into towns too small for a store of their own, and flagship buildings placed at the commercial heart of the cities large enough to support one. Unlike American chains that grew primarily through franchising, Eaton stayed a single corporate entity, family-owned and family-run, which meant consistency was rarely a problem. Every store, whether in Toronto, Winnipeg, Montreal, or later further west, carried the same pricing philosophy, the same guarantee, the same catalog backing it up. For decades, this corporate structure was Eaton's greatest strength. No franchise owner cutting corners, no regional manager diluting the brand. One company, one standard, coast to coast. But growth also meant footprint decisions that would take generations to fully reveal their consequences. As Toronto itself grew northward through the early 20th century, Eaton's followed the city's wealth rather than staying anchored to its original location. The company began construction on an ambitious new store on College Street, intending eventually to shift its entire Toronto operation away from the original Yonge and Queen site. Plans in the 1920s even called for a 38-story Art Deco tower, a structure that would have been among the largest retail and office complexes in the world. Then the Great Depression arrived, and those plans collapsed along with much of the economy. Eaton's built only 7 stories instead of 38, an impressive building still, but a visible symbol of ambition scaled back by forces the company could not control. For years afterward, both the original Queen Street store and the new College Street store operated simultaneously, with a company shuttle bus running shoppers between the two locations until Toronto's subway finally opened in the 1950s. This willingness to keep building bigger, more expensive flagship stores, even when the economics did not fully justify it, was not a flaw yet. In the 1920s and 1930s, it looked like confidence. Eaton's was so large, so central to Canadian commercial life, that betting on its own permanence seemed less like risk and more like common sense. The expansion also transformed what it meant to work for the company. In Winnipeg alone, staff numbers exploded from 750 on opening day in 1905 to 1,200 within weeks, into 8,000 by 1919. For many employees, particularly women entering retail and clerical work in growing numbers through the early 20th century, an Eaton's uniform represented steady, respectable employment at a time when such positions were not easy to come by. Families could point to an Eaton's job the way other families pointed to a position at a bank or a rail company. Proof of stability. But scale also brought pressure. Larger stores demanded more rigid systems, more hierarchy, more distance between the counter staff and the family whose name was on the building. What had once felt personal in that first cramped shop on Yonge Street began to feel, in the largest stores, more like an institution than a family business, even though the Eaton family itself never stopped running it. By the time the company crossed into the mid-20th century, it had grown from a single storefront into a retail network with stores across most provinces, buying offices as far away as London and Paris, and a mail-order operation reaching farmhouses that had never seen a city street. The machine that Timothy Eaton had started with one price and one promise was now enormous, national, and seemingly unstoppable. And it was exactly that unstoppable feeling that would prove decades later to be the most dangerous asset the company ever owned. By 1930, Eaton's had reached a height no Canadian retailer had touched before or would touch again. 60 cents of every dollar spent in a department store anywhere in the country went into an Eaton's till. Hudson's Bay Company, the fur trading giant that had operated across Canada for 2.5 centuries, could not match it. Simpson's, its closest true rival, could not match it. For a company founded 60 years earlier by an immigrant who had once failed at running a bakery, this was not just success, it was dominance on a scale that made Eaton synonymous, in the minds of most Canadians, with the very idea of shopping itself. That dominance was not simply financial, it was cultural, woven into the yearly rhythm of Canadian family life so tightly that most people never stopped to notice how completely one company had positioned itself there. Every autumn, the Christmas catalog arrived in the mail like clockwork, and every household that received it understood the unspoken ritual. Children circled the toys they wanted in pencil, parents quietly calculated what they could afford, and the layaway counter filled with families setting aside coats and gifts, paying them down week by week until they were finally, proudly theirs. Every December, the Santa Claus parade closed down blocks of downtown Toronto, and through radio and then television, closed down living rooms across the entire country at the same time. A child in Halifax and a child in Calgary could watch the exact same sleigh cross the exact same finish line, hosted by the exact same company on the exact same afternoon. Few brands in Canadian history have ever achieved that kind of simultaneous, nationwide emotional reach, and it did not stop with one generation. Grandparents who had circled toys in the catalog as children in the 1900s were, by the 1950s, bringing their own grandchildren to stand on the parade route and watch the same spectacle unfold. Parents who had received their first bicycle through layaway were setting aside payments for their own children's bicycles decades later at the very same counter in the very same store. This was the quiet engine underneath Eaton's dominance. Not advertising, not even convenience, but inheritance. Shopping at Eaton's was not a decision families made fresh each year. It was simply what their family did. The way attending a particular church or rooting for a particular hockey team was simply what a family did. Passed down without much discussion because it had never needed discussing. Inside the stores themselves, this cultural weight was matched by genuine civic presence. The Eaton Social and Athletic Club sponsored curling leagues, dances, and card nights that had nothing to do with selling merchandise and everything to do with the company positioning itself as a fixture of community life rather than merely a commercial tenant of it. In smaller cities across the country, an Eaton store opening was treated less like a business event and more like the arrival of an institution. The kind of moment a local newspaper covered on its front page, because the store's presence signaled that a town had, in some sense, arrived. For the employees who kept this machine running, the peak years carried their own particular pride. Working the floor at a flagship Eaton store, whether in Toronto, Winnipeg, or Montreal, meant working for the most recognized retail name in the country. It meant a kind of quiet local status. The neighbor who worked at Eaton's was understood, without further explanation, to hold a stable, respectable position. Multiplied across tens of thousands of employees nationwide, this pride became part of the company's identity as much as the catalog or the parade. What made a single company capable of embedding itself this deeply into the private, personal rituals of millions of families it would never meet in person? Part of the answer was simply time. 60 years of consistency, the same guarantee honored across 3 generations, the same catalog arriving without fail through depressions and wars alike. But part of the answer was also geography and scale working together in a way almost no other Canadian company could replicate. A mail-order network reaching farmhouses no railway spur could easily serve, paired with flagship stores anchoring the commercial heart of every major city from coast to coast. Eaton's was not simply large. It was everywhere that mattered all at once. In a country whose vast distances made that kind of unified national presence extraordinarily difficult to achieve. It is worth lingering here, in this moment, before moving forward. Because what was about to happen to this company did not happen to a struggling business scraping by on thin margins. It happened to the most trusted, most beloved, most deeply embedded retail name in Canadian history. Proof that no amount of cultural affection can, by itself, protect a company from the decisions made quietly, far from any customer's eye, inside the executive offices meant to steer it safely into the future. Those decisions had, in fact, already begun. In the 1970s, the trouble did not look like trouble at all. It looked like ambition. Across the country, provincial governments were running urban renewal programs designed to breathe new life into downtown cores that had begun losing shoppers to the suburbs. Eaton's, still riding the confidence of decades of dominance, became an eager partner. In cities like Sarnia, Brantford, Guelph, and Peterborough, the company anchored brand new downtown shopping malls, many of them carrying the Eaton Center name in tribute to the very brand that was supposed to guarantee their success. On paper, it looked like a natural next step for a company that had never stopped growing. In practice, it was a bet that Eaton's could not actually win. These smaller cities simply did not have the population or the purchasing power to sustain the kind of large-format downtown retail Eaton's was accustomed to building. High vacancy rates plagued the malls almost from the start. Storefronts sat empty. Foot traffic never matched what the company's own projections had promised. And yet Eaton's kept building, because for 100 years building bigger had always eventually worked out. Nobody inside the company seemed prepared for a version of the future where it wouldn't. At the same time, a very different kind of vulnerability was compounding the problem. The company's flagship stores, some dating back to the early 20th century, had grown enormous. Palatial buildings designed for an era when a single downtown location could expect tens of thousands of daily visitors. By the 1970s and 1980s, that kind of foot traffic was no longer guaranteed anywhere. The stores were, quite simply, too big for the sales they were generating, bleeding money on square footage that had once seemed like an asset and was quietly becoming a liability instead. Then the early 1980s recession hit, and it hit hard. Canadian consumers pulled back spending across the board, and Eaton's, carrying the weight of its oversized downtown footprint and its underperforming small city malls, had far less room to absorb the shock than its competitors did. Hudson's Bay Company, with its long history and diversified holdings, weathered the downturn more easily. Sears Canada, leaner and more disciplined in its expansion choices, did the same. Zellers, positioned firmly in the growing discount segment, actually gained ground. Piece by piece, market share that had once belonged almost exclusively to Eaton's began sliding toward rivals who had simply made more careful bets. None of this was visible to the ordinary customer walking through the doors of a Toronto or Winnipeg flagship store in, say, 1978. To them, Eaton's still looked and felt exactly as it always had. The same catalog in the mailbox every fall, the same Santa parade marching down Yonge Street every December, the same layaway counter humming with the same quiet dignity it had offered working families for generations. A shopper walking those familiar aisles that year had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. The counters were full, the lights were bright, the name over the door was the most trusted name in the country. But behind that familiar facade, the company's internal finances told a very different story. One of underperforming malls, overbuilt flagships, and a market share that had begun a slow, steady erosion nobody was moving urgently to stop. How long could a brand this beloved keep coasting on decades of trust before the underlying business finally caught up with it? Inside the company, the response to these warning signs was muted rather than alarmed. Executives had watched Eaton's dominate the Canadian retail landscape for over a century. There was little institutional appetite for the kind of hard, painful restructuring that the moment actually required: closing underperforming locations, scaling back the downtown mall partnerships, rethinking a flagship strategy built for a different era entirely. It was far easier and far more comfortable to treat the early warning signs as a temporary rough patch rather than the beginning of something structural. For a long-time employee working the floor of one of those flagship stores through this period, the shift would have been almost imperceptible day to day. A few more empty display cases here, a slightly quieter Tuesday afternoon there. Nothing dramatic enough to raise a real alarm. That, in the end, is exactly how the first cracks in a beloved institution usually appear. Not as a single dramatic failure, but as a slow accumulation of small, forgivable compromises that nobody with the power to stop them was willing to call by its real name. By the time the 1980s gave way to the 1990s, those small compromises had compounded into something far more serious. And a new competitor was about to arrive from the south of the border, one that played by an entirely different set of rules. Rules that a company built on a century of the same familiar promise had never had to face before. There was no outside raider who came to strip Eaton's for parts. No private equity firm loaded the company with debt and walked away with the proceeds. What happened to Eaton's was, in some ways, harder to watch because the damage came from inside the family that had built the company in the first place. By the 1980s, control of the T. Eaton Company had passed two generations beyond Timothy Eaton himself, resting with descendants who had inherited an empire rather than built one. Inheriting a company and understanding how to run it in a changing marketplace are not the same skill, and the gap between the two widened with each passing year. Where Timothy Eaton had personally toured every corner of his stores looking for a single fault to correct, later generations of Eaton leadership operated at a greater distance from the sales floor, making strategic decisions about flagship expansion and downtown mall partnerships without the same intimate feel for what customers actually wanted or where the market was actually heading. The clearest example of this drift was the company's continued attachment to its enormous flagship stores. Even as retail patterns across North America shifted decisively towards smaller format, suburban, and eventually discount shopping, competitors adapted. Eaton's largely did not. The downtown palaces that had once been the company's greatest asset, vast architecturally ambitious buildings meant to project permanence and prestige, became instead a growing financial burden, expensive to maintain and increasingly mismatched to how Canadians actually wanted to shop by the 1980s and into the 1990s. Then, in the early 1990s, the threat that would ultimately prove fatal arrived from south of the border. Walmart began its expansion into Canada, and it did not compete on nostalgia, catalogs, or Santa parades. It competed on price, squeezing suppliers relentlessly to offer the lowest possible cost to a country still recovering from a painful recession. For consumers who had spent years watching their household budgets tighten, that proposition was almost impossible to resist. Eaton's, still carrying the cost structure of its oversized flagship stores and still operating with the institutional caution of a company that had never truly had to fight for market share before, had no comparable answer. Behind the scenes, the company's finances were deteriorating in ways that would eventually become impossible to hide. By 1997, Eaton's owed more than $300 million to banks and suppliers combined, a debt load the company could no longer service under its existing structure. That year, George Eaton, standing at the head of the very family whose name had defined Canadian retail for over a century, was forced to make an admission no Eaton before him had ever had to make publicly. The company could not meet its obligations. Eaton sought protection under the Federal Companies Creditors Arrangement Act, the legal mechanism that gives a struggling company breathing room to restructure rather than collapse outright. What followed was not a swift correction, but 2 long years of cutting. Underperforming stores closed. Staff were let go. Marketing missteps compounded the damage, most notably the cancellation of the company's once popular Trans-Canada sale, a decision that alienated exactly the kind of loyal, longtime customers Eaton's could least afford to lose. Each cut was framed internally as a necessary step toward stabilization. Each one also chipped away, publicly and visibly, at the sense of permanence that had defined the brand for generations. For the people who worked inside Eaton's during these years, the experience was one of watching a beloved institution try and repeatedly fail to save itself. Longtime staff who had spent decades on the sales floor, some of them second-generation employees whose own parents had once worked the same counters, now found themselves absorbing round after round of closures and restructuring announcements, never quite certain whether their own store or their own position would survive the next cut. The pride that had once come with saying, "I work at Eaton's," was, by the mid-1990s, mixed increasingly with anxiety about how much longer that sentence would remain true. Nowhere was the human cost of the company's decline more visible than in its smaller market locations, the very stores born out of the overambitious downtown mall partnerships of the 1970s. As Eaton's began closing underperforming outlets to conserve cash, towns like Dartmouth, Nova Scotia watched their local Eaton's, often one of the few full-service department stores in the region, simply disappear from the community, taking local jobs and a piece of the town's commercial identity with it. Perhaps the most damning detail, revealed decades earlier during a Federal Royal Commission investigation into the company's pricing practices, but echoing forward into how Eaton's was ultimately remembered, was the gap between what ordinary employees earned and what those at the very top collected. That inquiry had found company directors drawing substantial wages, bonuses, and pensions, even during periods when Eaton's was cutting jobs and wages on the sales floor. It was not a new pattern by the 1990s. It was a long-standing one, and it left the company with little internal culture of shared sacrifice, precisely when shared sacrifice was what survival required. By 1997, the market share numbers made the scale of the collapse unmistakable. The T. Eaton Company, which had controlled 60% of department store sales in Canada in 1930, now held just 11%. 2 years of restructuring under creditor protection had not reversed the slide. It had at best slowed it slightly, buying the company time it would ultimately fail to use. Who exactly was supposed to protect the tens of thousands of employees and the millions of loyal customers who had trusted this name for over a century, when the family entrusted with the company's future proved unable to adapt it to a changed world? There is no single villain in this part of the story, no outside predator to blame, no faceless financier who swept in to strip the company bare. There is only a slow generational drift away from the instincts that had built Eaton's in the first place. Compounded by external competition, the company was simply too slow and too encumbered by its own past success to meet head-on. By 1999, there would be no more restructuring plans left to try. The year 1998 was supposed to be the year Eaton's proved its restructuring plan was working. Instead, it delivered the opposite. Despite 2 years of store closures, staff reductions, and cost-cutting under creditor protection, the company closed out 1998 with a net loss of $72 million. For a company that had once controlled 60% of Canadian department store sales, the number was not just disappointing. It was proof that the bleeding had never actually stopped. It had only been managed quietly while executives searched for a plan that could reverse it. There was no such plan. In early 1999, Eaton's announced a further round of store closures alongside another corporate restructuring effort, the second major attempt in 2 years to right a company that had already spent its credibility on the first one. Inside boardrooms, the language was careful and procedural. Talk of consolidation, of focusing resources, of positioning the company for long-term stability. Outside those rooms, in the towns and cities where Eaton's stores still operated, the language that mattered was simpler. Another closure list, another round of layoffs, another chunk of a 130-year-old company being cut away in the hope that what remained might survive. It did not survive. In August 1999, the T. Eaton Company filed for bankruptcy. At the moment of collapse, what had once been a national empire stretching coast to coast had been reduced to 64 department stores, 2 home stores, and a single warehouse. 64 stores for a company that had once anchored downtown cores in every province in the country. The number alone told the story of a decade-long retreat that had finally run out of road. Sears Canada moved quickly. Within weeks of the bankruptcy filing, Sears purchased all outstanding shares of the T. Eaton Company, acquiring 8 of the remaining stores outright and negotiating an option to buy 5 more for $30 million. For a rival that Eaton's had outsold and outlasted for most of the 20th century, it was an extraordinary reversal. The Hunter becoming, quite literally, the company that would decide which pieces of its former competitor deserved to survive at all. Then came the date that closed the book entirely. On October 17, 1999, every remaining Eaton store that had not been picked up by Sears was shut down all at once, and the company was formally liquidated. 130 years of continuous operation ended not with a slow fade, but with a single coordinated closure. Doors locked, lights turned off, fixtures marked for sale in dozens of cities simultaneously. By late October, nearly every Eaton's location in the country had been emptied and closed. Only 5 suburban stores were spared in the short term, kept open at Brentwood Mall, St. Vital Center, Galeries de la Capitale, Westmount Shopping Center, and Sherway Gardens. A handful of locations carrying the name into a final, uncertain chapter under new ownership. For the employees inside those stores in the final weeks, the experience was one almost impossible to prepare for, no matter how many rounds of layoffs had come before. Many had worked the same sales floor for decades. Some were second-generation Eaton's employees, following parents who had worked the very same counters years earlier, inheriting not just a job but a kind of quiet family pride that came with the name on their uniform. Now they were watching liquidation signs go up in windows that had, only months earlier, still displayed the same seasonal catalog promotions the company had run for generations. There was no ceremony to mark the end of 130 years. There was only a closing date, a final schedule, and the slow, surreal work of clearing out a store that had never, in living memory, expected to actually close. For customers, the final weeks carried their own particular strangeness. Longtime shoppers who had once stood in November layaway lines to set aside a coat or a Christmas gift now walked past liquidation banners advertising discounts of 50, then 70, then 90% off merchandise that would never be restocked. Shelves that had been reliably full for generations emptied in a matter of days. Display cases that once held carefully arranged seasonal goods sat bare, waiting only for fixtures to be sold off along with everything else. For shoppers who had grown up with the Eaton's catalog arriving every autumn like clockwork, walking through a half-emptied flagship store in its final days felt less like a sale and more like watching a familiar room being dismantled around them. The press covered the collapse with the gravity typically reserved for a genuinely national event, because that, in every meaningful sense, is exactly what it was. Newspapers that had once carried Eaton's advertisements for holiday sales and catalog launches now ran retrospectives on the company's 130-year history, cataloging its rise from a single storefront on Yonge Street to the dominant force in Canadian retail, and now finally its end. There was no triumphant business story to tell here, only the quiet, well-documented arc of a beloved institution that had simply run out of time. Winnipeg's flagship, the store still remembered locally as the Big Store, closed and emptied along with the rest of the chain in 1999. It would stand vacant for 3 years before being demolished in 2002 to make way for a new downtown arena. In a gesture that captured exactly what the building had meant to the city, its red bricks were preserved and incorporated directly into the facade of the new arena, a physical fragment of the original store built into whatever came to replace it. A way of ensuring that something of the Big Store would remain standing on that ground, even after the store itself was gone. The bankruptcy filing and the immediate liquidation that followed represented the fastest, most complete unraveling in the company's entire history. Where the slide from dominance had unfolded slowly across 2 decades, the failed small city malls of the 1970s, the market share erosion of the 1980s, the mounting debt of the 1990s, the actual end arrived within a span of months. A net loss announced in early 1998. A bankruptcy filing in August 1999. A single coordinated closure date 2 months later. What had taken 130 years to build had, in the final accounting, taken barely more than a year to formally end. By the close of October 1999, The T. Eaton Company Limited existed only in the memories of the millions of Canadians who had shopped its aisles, waited for its catalog, and lined its parade routes for generations. The stores were empty. The name belonged, for now, to Sears, and a piece of Canadian retail history that had once seemed as permanent as the changing seasons had, in the space of a single autumn, come to an end. The doors closed in October 1999, but the story of Eaton's did not end quite so cleanly. Sears Canada, having absorbed the company's shares in its most valuable remaining locations, made one final attempt to keep the name alive rather than let it disappear entirely. Beginning in 2000, Sears relaunched a small, upscale chain of stores under the Eaton's banner, a lowercase rebrand meant to signal something fresh while still trading on 130 years of accumulated trust. 7 stores carried the name forward into the new decade. The attempt did not survive contact with the marketplace. Hudson's Bay, watching a wounded rival's brand come back from the dead, moved to make sure it stayed dead, publicly warning vendors and suppliers against stocking the resurrected Eaton stores. Facing pressure from Canada's remaining department store giant, suppliers grew cautious, and the new stores struggled to keep their shelves filled with the kind of merchandise that had once been Eaton's signature. By 2002, Sears quietly pulled the plug, converting the last Eaton's locations into standard Sears stores. The name that had once meant more to Canadian retail than any other now belonged to no one at all, a trademark with nowhere left to hang. What replaced Eaton's in almost every sense was the very company that had absorbed it. Sears Canada took over most of the flagship locations, the customer base, and much of the market share that Eaton's had spent 13 decades building. But Sears Canada's own fortunes would not prove much more durable. The Toronto Eaton Centre store, once Eaton's crown jewel, passed from Sears to Nordstrom in the years that followed, and Sears Canada itself filed for bankruptcy and went out of business entirely by 2018. A reminder that the pressures which had ended Eaton's did not disappear once Eaton's was gone. They simply moved on to claim the next department store standing in their path. The physical spaces Eaton's left behind tell their own scattered story of loss and adaptation. In Winnipeg, the big store stood empty for 3 years before being torn down in 2002, its red brick facade preserved and rebuilt into the walls of a new downtown arena, so that something of the original building still stands on that ground today, repurposed rather than erased. In Toronto, the Eaton Centre Mall that had once been built specifically to keep the struggling chain afloat outlived the very company it was named for, eventually severing its last formal ties to the Eaton family trademarks in 2016, even as the name itself remained stamped across the building's entrances as a kind of inherited tribute. In Montreal, the former Eaton's flagship was renovated and reopened as an entirely different retail complex, its original identity folded into something new. And in some smaller cities, the very towns where Eaton's had made its riskiest downtown mall bets back in the 1970s, the malls that once carried the Eaton Centre name simply could not find a second life at all, sliding instead toward high vacancy, and in some cases, eventual demolition or conversion to entirely non-retail uses like college campuses, libraries, or office space. For the tens of thousands of employees who had built careers inside Eaton stores, the aftermath was deeply personal in ways that no corporate history can fully capture. Some transitioned into positions at Sears Canada, carrying institutional knowledge of the sales floor into a new company with a different name over the door. Others, particularly longtime staff nearing the end of their careers, found the transition far harder, losing not just a paycheck, but a professional identity built over 20 or 30 years in the same uniform, at the same counter, sometimes in the same store their own parents had worked decades earlier. The broader lesson for Canadian retail was not subtle, even if it took an entire decade to fully play out. Eaton's had been Canada's most trusted department store name for over a century, and that trust alone was not enough to protect it from a changing marketplace. A network built for an earlier era of shopping, enormous downtown flagships, mail-order catalogs, layaway counters, could not simply coast on inherited loyalty once a leaner, price-driven competitor from south of the border arrived and refused to compete on nostalgia. Hudson's Bay adapted. Sears Canada, for a time, adapted. Eaton's, weighed down by two generations of leadership less attuned to a shifting market than the company's founder had been, adapted too slowly and then not at all. What does it mean when the institution a country built so much of its shared shopping memory around simply disappears and nothing quite replaces the particular thing it offered? A Walmart can sell a coat. It cannot recreate a Santa Claus parade broadcast into every living room in the country on the same December afternoon, or a catalog arriving at a farmhouse door like a promise renewed every autumn, or a layaway counter that let a family provide for a child without ever touching debt. Some things a company builds cannot simply be transferred to whoever buys the assets. They end when the company that created them ends, and no acquisition, however well-financed, can bring them back. Picture a kitchen table in late September, somewhere on the Canadian prairies decades ago. A booklet arrives in the mailbox, thick with pages, and a child sets it open across the table under the kitchen light. There is a pencil in hand. There is a coat on page 40, a pair of ice skates further on, and a doll with painted eyes that will be circled twice, just to be certain. Outside, the first cold of autumn is already settling in, and this book, more than the calendar, is what tells the family that the season is turning. Picture two, a curb on Yonge Street in December, packed three deep with families in wool coats, breath rising in the cold air. Somewhere down the block, a brass band begins, and a small, sad-eyed bear rides past on a float. And then finally the sleigh itself rounds the corner. And for one afternoon, an entire country seems to be standing on the same street corner at the same time. And picture a Saturday afternoon on a store floor, a mother handing coins across a counter, a slip of paper marked with a coat's price, a promise that, in 11 more weekly payments, that coat would finally, truly belong to her son. None of this was ever really about the merchandise. A coat is a coat. A catalog is paper and ink. What Eaton's actually sold for 130 years was something far harder to put a price tag on. The quiet dignity of a family being able to provide on their own terms and their own timeline, without ever having to ask anyone for charity or credit they couldn't repay. For a country as vast and as sparsely connected as Canada, Eaton's did something almost no other institution managed to do. It reached a child on an isolated prairie farm and a child on a crowded Toronto street with the exact same catalog, the exact same parade broadcasts, the exact same promise that abundance existed somewhere and could, with patience and a little saving, eventually be theirs. It gave working families a system built on trust rather than debt, at a time when very few businesses were willing to extend that kind of trust to people with modest means. And it gave tens of thousands of employees across generations of the same families something to be quietly proud of every single day they put on the uniform. What did Eaton's enable that nothing since has quite managed to replace? Not simply low prices. Plenty of stores offer those. What it offered was continuity, the same trusted name arriving at the same time every year, generation after generation, so reliably that families built their own private rituals directly on top of it, without ever having to think twice about whether it would still be there next year. That kind of inherited, unquestioned trust is not something a company can manufacture quickly. It can only be built slowly over decades, and once it disappears, it does not simply transfer to whoever buys the name next. Somewhere tonight, someone is describing the Eaton's Christmas catalog to a grandchild who will never hold one. The weight of it in small hands, the smell of the fresh pages, the particular quiet of a kitchen table in autumn while a pencil circles a toy on page 40. The child will never feel that weight for themselves, but they will understand from the way it is described that something real once arrived in mailboxes across this country every year, and that its arrival meant something to the people who waited for it. Timothy Eaton built a store on a promise that no customer, rich or poor, would ever be treated differently at his counter. For 130 years, in some form, that promise held. It held through two world wars, through the Depression, through a changing city that grew up around a small shop at Yonge in Queen, until that shop became the beating commercial heart of a nation. It is worth remembering the tens of thousands of employees who spent their working lives inside those stores, the families who saved week by week at the layaway counter, and the man himself who once walked his own new store looking for a single flaw and found none. The name is gone from the storefronts now. The parade belongs to other sponsors, but the bricks of the big store still stand, rebuilt into a different wall in Winnipeg, and the Eaton Center still bears the name in Toronto and Montreal, a quiet inheritance nobody has quite been able to let go of entirely. Some things, it turns out, are worth remembering long after the doors have closed for good.